Global Conservation Corps presents the Rhino Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of Rhino Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. In this episode, I'm talking with Nick Brandt. Nick is a conservationist and photographer who uses his captivating art to champion environmental causes. Nick was born and raised in London, where he originally studied painting and film. He now lives in the Southern Californian mountains. In 2010, Nick co-founded Big Life Foundation, a nonprofit in Kenya and Tanzania that employ more than 300 local rangers protecting 1.6 million acres of the Amboseli Kilimanjaro ecosystem. The themes in Nick's photographic series relate to the destructive impact that humankind is having on both the natural world and now humans themselves too. In this conversation, we talk about Nick's confrontation with elephant poaching in East Africa and how that sparked his journey from photographer to conservationist, leading to the creation of Big Life Foundation. We dive deep into his art series, from the East African Trilogy to Inherit the Dust and This Empty World to The Day May Break. We go into his process and the logistics for these massive artistic undertakings, and we spend time digging into the environmental issues that currently plague our planet, along with stories of some of the resilient humans in his photographs. Before we jump in, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe to and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform, and to share it on social media and with your friends. With your support, the Rhino Man podcast can continue to grow. Now, without further ado, here's my wide-ranging conversation with Nick Brandt. All right, welcome to the show, Nick. Really great to have you on here.
Glad to be on.
Yeah, so I first came across your work when I was in Kenya at Big Life at Richard Bonham's home. It was just kind of a wandering side trip when I was going back to South Africa, reconnecting with some people kind of in relation to this film, and got invited up that way. And I just remember being really captured by the images that you created, and it kind of took me on this little path. I think Richard kind of talked a little bit about the beginnings of Big Life and your connection, and I looked up your work and was just like, it just draws you in, and there's so many layers to it. So I'm really excited to have you on to dive into some of this work, but also a lot of the work you're doing in conservation and your thoughts around the environment and all of the great things happening there. So yeah, it's going to be a good conversation.
I hope so. Hope I don't let you down.
Yeah. So why don't we start out, I'd love to learn about Big Life and how that all began, but I'm curious, what sparked you to kind of move in this direction? I've spent a little bit, I think it was in Kenya for a week, and completely different environment from South Africa from where I'm used to. Just these amazing open landscapes and wildlife walking in and out of community areas and people grazing their cattle in the fields there. Such a beautiful place. So I'm curious, is this where this tug or pull to move into the conservation space, doing something for the environment through your work, was that where this all began?
So I had been photographing for some time in East Africa, and I was always asking people I knew there, who can I donate to kind of help? And generally speaking, there was a lot of negative comments about, especially the larger groups, the larger NGOs that were there. And then I had last been in East Africa in 2008, and CITES had allowed the sell-off from certain countries of their ivory stash. And this triggered a whole new wave of poaching across Africa. So I was last there in 2008, and I went back in 2010 and was suddenly witness to a very different landscape where elephants were just running away in terror from cars, having been very relaxed in prior years. And the reason was there'd been this massive escalation in poaching. And it was elephants were being killed in the Amboseli ecosystem, where I took a lot of photographs on an kind of almost weekly basis. And when it really struck home was when this wonderful elephant called Igor, named by Cynthia Moss of Amboseli Elephant Trust, was killed just outside the park. And this elephant, Igor, it's in a photograph called Elephant Drinking.
Mm.
And because Igor was so incredibly trusting, I was able to take a photograph from very, very close. And it was possibly that level of trust that got him killed, and his tusks hacked out of his face. And I think perhaps what a lot of people don't know is that axes and chainsaws, so an animal is brought down, whether through poison or whatever, speared, and it's still alive when the poachers come in and hack the tusks out of his or her face. Because, of course, 1/3 of the tusk is inside the skull. So it's a truly horrifying way to die. And that photograph was he was sort of flagship photo of my early years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like something had to be done. And Amboseli National Park is only 100,000 acres. 80% of the time, the animals are not in the park. They're moving outside into the adjoining community areas where they have no protection, where they had no protection. Mm-hmm. Because the understaffed, underfunded Kenya Wildlife Service can barely cover even the tiny 100,000 acre park. And there were no NGOs sufficiently funded to do anything effective in terms of protecting any of the animals outside. So I kind of drew up a list of criteria, one of which included needing to have rangers on the other side of the border, just over the border in Tanzania, because a lot of poachers were coming over from Tanzania, poaching the elephants in Kenya, and then getting and taking them back over the border with complete impunity into that Tanzania where there was nobody to catch them. So we needed rangers on both sides of the border. So I had all these sort of ideas, and I went to see a very wealthy collector of my work in New York and told her what I wanted to do. And to my absolute astonishment, she wrote a check for $1 million. Mm. I then wrote to Richard and said, can you think of anybody who could run this organization? And I told him my ideas, and he said, I've been saying all what you're saying for the last 20 years, and I should run it. So sounded great because Richard is amazing. He'd already done incredible work in the Chulus, the adjoining Chulus, mm-hmm. for 20 years with the Masai Land Preservation Trust. And so he had all the experience and knowledge and understanding of working with local communities, which is essential. It's what a lot of these big organizations don't understand, that you've got to have that connection with the local communities, because our ethos right from the beginning was if conservation supports the community, then the communities will hopefully support conservation.
Exactly.
And that has been what has been our philosophy and guided our actions over the last, 12 years. So Richard came on, and then with that $1 million, we were able to hire rangers, build outposts, buy patrol vehicles. And within a very short space of time, the rangers were finally, after years, if not, a decade or more, they were able to start arresting poachers who were operating with impunity. And since then, in the 12 years since, the incidence of poaching of all animals has dramatically reduced. There are almost no elephants these days killed by poachers, way less killed in human-wildlife conflict due to our 100-kilometer electrified fence between the farmland and the wild habitat, because a lot of them were getting speared as a result of invading farmers' mm-hmm. crops. And the populations of elephant, cheetahs, lion, and giraffe have all gone up as a result of the presence of the rangers. And it's now 1.6 million acres that are patrolled by Big Life Rangers. And we have around 350 rangers and total employees of about 500, and almost everybody, bar, like Richard and stuff, are local.
Yeah.
So there's a huge investment in protecting, in the conservation of that area for the community, because pragmatically speaking, it brings a huge amount in employment. And of course, there are scholarships, and there's compensation for herders who lose their livestock to lions, so it discourages them from going out and killing lions by way of retribution, which is why the population has gone up. One of the main reasons the population has gone up.
Mm-hmm.
It's so far quite a successful conservation story for big life in that area. Now, the biggest challenge of all has been trying to deal with land development as individual local Maasai start selling off their newly acquired parcels of land as the land has been subdivided. And so far, we've had significant success at raising money to be able to lease land to maintain it as wildlife corridors and disbursement areas for sufficient food, because otherwise it would all just get developed into farmland and any other number of things.
Yeah, I mean, what an incredible project, grown from kind of just an idea to over 500 employees, 350 rangers. That's pretty wild. I mean, can you kind of go back to those early days? I mean, was Igor kind of the one that sparked this drive in you to actually get out there and do something? Or, I mean, I guess it was a culmination.
Well, it was a combination of things. It was, Igor as a kind of catalyst, but also it was just incredibly upsetting to, as I said, almost on a weekly basis, to see elephants that I knew be killed. I mean, it was constant. And I mean, listen, I did not imagine becoming a conservationist. Never thought to start my own organization. It was merely, it felt like a kind of necessity because there was a gaping hole in that area. When it was crazy that there was, considering that the Amboseli Kilimanjaro ecosystem is one of the most famous in the world. It's one of the best places to view elephants in Africa, and yet nothing was being done of any consequence, there was no meaningful action.
Yeah, nobody was prepared for that onslaught. It's really interesting too, just going back to the CITES allowing those stockpiles to be sold off and how that just sparked this. I mean, I guess that's a big reason why they burn a lot of this stuff now at a lot of different sites, whether it's rhino horn or elephant tusks. I'd like to talk a little bit about rangers since they play such a huge role in this. And that's actually the main reason I came to visit. I was with Sean Wilmore from the Thin Green Line Foundation, and we had just been over at Lead Ranger, and part of their program was implemented over at Big Life. So got to meet Francis and all those guys, and they did a nice demonstration. And yeah, just an amazing team there. I mean, just great people, just so caring and passionate, and just really well equipped, and look pretty sharp in their gear, and just really on point. So can you talk a little bit about how that was developed? I don't know how much you had a role in that, or if Richard kind of took the reins from that point and started putting together the Ranger Corps. But yeah, they seem to be playing an amazing role there.
Yeah, I mean, listen, that is one of Richard's strengths. And he'd had a lot of experience, as I said, in the 20 years prior on no money, or very little. And because he didn't have access to these, wealthy people in America that I did. But yeah, I mean, that was very much Richard just having a fantastic working relationship with local community and knowing how to organize.
Can you just talk about the Rangers there? Do you have any experiences with any of them? Just who they are as people, where they come from. I'm guessing most of them come from the local communities there. Can you talk a little bit about who the Rangers are?
Well, again, that is the value of locally employed people. So at the beginning, it wasn't just a case when the poaching was really bad. It wasn't just a case of the Rangers out there patrolling, because their families, their brothers and sisters and parents were more eyes on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So if poachers came in from Tanzania or wherever, they might be seen by a ranger's sister, and then that would get reported. So it became much harder for poachers to get away without being arrested. But that relationship with the local community is everything. I mean, it just simply wouldn't work in the same way if you didn't have those local people with all their knowledge as well. And sometimes, by the way, ex-poachers who often make the best rangers because they understand the mindset of what the poacher is going to do. Now, just to be clear, I mean, I'm talking like there's still poaching going on. I'm just talking about this was at the beginning. What we were basically doing was triage.
Yeah.
We were trying to stem the flow of blood. And that was then dealt with. And then the next problem became the human-wildlife conflict, thus the building of the electrified fence. I think that started around 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next problem, the most recent, as mentioned, is this land subdivision, which I was really frightened that people would not respond and donate, because we're talking about huge amounts of money. And as more land gets developed, you need even more money, because you've got to kind of project forward and consider the cumulative ongoing cost of leasing more and more and more thousands of acres. So there's no point having all these rangers driving around if there's nowhere left for the animals to move.
Mm-hmm.
And what it also means is that as there's less and less wild habitat, when these ever worsening droughts come along, those droughts are going to be all the more lethal, because between the wildlife and the livestock, there just isn't enough food, grassland to go around. People think of Africa, as this like vast rolling plains, but there's very, very few places left in Africa that are unprotected that can still support wild animals. You've either got to have it be conserved, obviously national parks, reserves, but it also community areas, and I'm afraid to say in southern Africa, and hunting concession areas, which is sort of a necessary evil. I mean, because a lot of those places would be devoid of all wildlife if there weren't these hunting concessions for people to come in. And I mean, it appalls me personally as somebody who's a vegan and doesn't eat animals, because to me they have just as much right to live as a human being. But again, trying to be pragmatic, there's if somebody's paying $50,000 to kill some poor unsuspecting lion to have their head decapitated and put on their wall, you can obviously gather my feelings on this. If that helps preserve an entire ecosystem with thousands of other animals, well, okay, you can't expect in this day and age for places to be preserved without some pragmatic consideration of the finances involved in that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many pressures, and we've done so much to break up the landscape and destroy a lot of the land that, we have to make a lot of compromises now to manage it and keep it alive. It's it's kind of like the lesser of two evils, I guess, in a way. I meant you mentioned droughts, and I know when I was there back in September, the droughts were pretty bad. I don't know if they've gotten any rain since then, but I know
not enough. I mean, when you were there, were you driving around and just seeing carcasses all over the place?
Yeah, saw a couple of zebras, and I heard a lot about some, carcasses were dropping all over the place.
Yeah.
And the dust devils, I was looking through a lot of your work, and in A Shadow Falls, you have the giraffes with the dust devil, and it's just, I've never seen a place like that where there's just dust devils. I mean, you look out and it looked almost like a post-apocalyptic landscape with those dust devils out there, because it's so dry and the farmers weren't able to grow, which then puts pressure on them to probably poach or find other ways to make money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And coming off of COVID, where again, a lot of people, like in tourism, were unemployed because there were no tourists coming. And so that puts more pressure and creates a big increase in bushmeat poaching because people have to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard that and seen that during COVID. I've heard about that all over the world. And it's understandable.
Yeah.
I don't approve of industrial level poaching to feed people in the cities. But you have to be sympathetic to poor rural people who are out of a job because of, their job being taken away and doing that to survive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and talking about communities, in South Africa, I know there's been a lot of work recently to try and engage the communities, get them more connected, give them experiences, give them ways to benefit from these conservation spaces, because just like you were saying earlier, unless they're benefiting in some way or feel like it's theirs or it actually is theirs, even better, then they're not going to have an incentive to protect it. Or, like you said, they'll have to find other ways to survive, to make money. So it's really important that we move in that direction overall. Going into your work a little bit, from this point on, was there a conscious decision to move into creating art that fed into this new, I don't know if you could call it like a new passion of yours, to use it to build more awareness, to raise more funds? What was that development over those early years in the Amboseli to?
Well, I mean, I've only ever taken photos purely for myself, and if people respond to it, great. But I just wanted in my work to address in a much more direct, visceral way the escalation of destruction that I saw happening as space for animals, and how human beings, rural poor in particular, were being impacted.
Yeah. So how did that develop? I mean, after the original On This Earth trilogy, I say original, but kind of working in this vein, you moved on to Inherit the Dust, which is another stunning collection.
Thank you.
What kind of drove you to, and I feel like we can maybe talk about this too, your projects, and I don't know what you did before you got into this topic. Your projects got bigger and bigger in terms of how to actually make them happen.
I know. It's kind of, man, I just...
It's impressive.
Yeah, that's
like film sets.
It's actually also kind of insane because of the amount of money I was spending, because everything's self-funded. So Inherit the Dust was really based on, again, if you look at the animals that used to inhabit the places where we now live, the very land that you or any American or European listener is on, what wild animals used to roam, whether it was woolly mammoths or saber-toothed tigers or whatever. And in a lot of instances, those animals were actually wiped out by early killing by humans. And the point is that in East Africa, animals as equally extraordinary do still live, but in fewer and fewer places. So there's a sort of invasion of their space by humankind. And it's not, to be very clear, the fault of the local people. They are also simply trying to survive. So I took photographs that I'd kind of rejected over the years, that had never made it off my contact sheets, but realized they had a use, and a superior use, to be printed up life-size and glued to panels that were placed in landscapes where animals such as those used to roam, but due to human invasion no longer do. And then I would, almost like street photography, just wait until people living in those places just kind of became oblivious to these giant panels. The animals in those photographs kind of became like ghosts in the landscape. And then I would start photographing these panoramas of these animals on these panels within these now, destroyed landscapes.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like when I first saw them, it shocks you into I don't know, a sadness of what's been lost and the reality of what our population growth is doing. And yeah, it's something you probably will never be able to get back. And I think it really does an amazing job at telling that story. I mean, what was the response, or for you, I guess, what was it like putting this out there, and what was the response and the conversation around it?
Well, honestly, you kind of always want your work to be kind of have a profound impact on the whole world. So within that level of delusion and sort of tempering it accordingly, I just always feel that anybody working in any kind of arena where they're trying to showcase injustice or something within the social, political, environmental worlds, if one is just a small cog in the wheel of incremental change, anything,
Mm.
any difference, any enlightenment, any extension of the dialogue around all this is important and useful. And it's a kind of a cumulative thing that those of us involved in that, we're all just cumulatively hoping to make a difference.
Mm.
It's, yes, it got loads of press coverage. Yes, it had loads of exhibitions, but it's still frustrating. And I think this applies to anybody working in this kind of arena, that media will focus on so much trivial, superficial stuff. And I mean, look, every goddamn media outlet in this day and age should be writing daily about the impacts of climate change.
Mm.
The Guardian does a decent job of it, but very, very, very few others. So it's just all by way of saying I'm always disappointed that we don't make more of a difference, but that will never stop me as long as I'm able to continue to do that kind of work.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a challenge and maybe it's just because of the scale of the problem, it feels like to really have enough impact to to make a difference. Sometimes it can be hard to judge that, but on the other hand, one person could change the world, and you could have made something click in their mind that sent them on the path to doing that. So you
never
just don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah. How do you channel your voice or this energy? I feel like I've listened to you speak a couple times, and you you talk about, maybe I saw this in your writing too. It's better to be angry and active than angry and passive.
Yes.
It sounds like you use the anger generated by what you see to really funnel that into being productive and doing some work that you hope makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean, look, when people hear anger, they automatically think negative. I don't. I think if it's used to productive ends, it's actually incredibly positive. And it galvanizes you. It gives you focus. It energizes you. It makes you feel like you're doing something useful and potentially making a difference. It doesn't matter. You don't need to start a NGO. You can just do stuff on a completely local level, and also in just how you live your life. Buying organic food so you're not responsible for yet more pesticide adding to the insect apocalypse already happening because of pesticides. Just not buying one-use plastic. I mean, there's so many things everybody can do on a micro level on up.
Mm-hmm. Does the anger ever overwhelm you and affect your life, or do you feel like you have a balance? I mean,
it doesn't overwhelm me, surprisingly, in conservation terms. It does in political terms. When I think about people like Rupert Murdoch and almost the entire Republican Party in America, then yes, it does. And if we've instantly lost a bunch of listeners who vote for the anti-environmental Republicans, there it goes. I mean, I know I'm supposed to sort of convert those who think differently and not be just I tell you what, one thing is it does always worry me that I'm preaching to the converted. That those who are interested in listening and viewing already think the same as me. But I've never been able to personally, one-on-one, I've never been able to persuade a climate change denier that climate change exists, with all the bloody statistics in the world. Still haven't been able to do it. But even if you are only preaching to the converted, it still is out there and giving each of us a sort of psychological support, because it is pretty bloody depressing. And we need all the shared mutual support, I can't think of a better word, that we can.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I don't know if any hot topic it's really possible to change someone's mind in a conversation, but I guess there might be the potential to plant seeds, and maybe that's even better to happen through your work, where someone sees it and then they're drawn in, and then a story's told, and maybe it doesn't hit them right then and change their mind, but it's back there doing its work over time, and hopefully it has an effect on some people and leading them in a better direction. So, yeah. What do you say, kind of speaking more towards the artists, what do you tell people in terms of developing a voice and finding their voice? Because I feel like through this work, I mean, you've got such a strong visual voice, but then also you're speaking and writing, and the work that's directly benefiting conservation projects. It's kind of a whole body together that you're putting out there. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts or advice around developing that, or finding what drives your work.
I mean, I've already sort of partly covered that with what I said about being angry and active, but I've also taken to saying recently 2 words: Greta Thunberg. If one young girl can start all alone on a street corner with a placard, and within an incredibly short space of time inspire kids all around the world, then all of us in our own way, to varying degrees, can be Greta Thunberg. And again, like I said, it can be from the micro level, local level on up, depending on what is possible for you within how you live. Millions, if not billions, of small actions can accumulate into something significant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess moving forward to the next project, this Empty World, it feels like it's taking a similar idea, but it definitely seems like a bigger logistical project. I don't know if you could talk to what inspired this direction and how you developed it and what you were trying to say with it.
I mean, strictly speaking, it should have come before Inherit the Dust, because in this particular instance, it's symbolic of the animals that are still populating the fast diminishing wild areas, and how they are being squeezed out as humans progress, rapidly invade those areas. So in the case of those photographs, which was my first and only color series, and my first digital, not shot on film, this was the one which was, when we were talking about the production, which I could never afford to do now, but it became an obsession. And when I have an obsession, kind of no amount of common sense or your mum worrying about you and whether you'll have to sell your house to finance it will stop you. But in this instance, so what we did is we set up 10 cameras across the Amboseli ecosystem just outside the park, in precisely these areas where at night the animals would come out. And we set up 10 cameras with water holes and cameras to photograph the animals at night, but with a plan in mind, where it would be like rephotography. They would be photographed once, and then in the exact same position with the cameras locked off, never moving, the same shot would be rephotographed, but this time populated with both people and sets of varying scale that were kind of urban, be it a petrol station, an overpass under construction, a place where there was charcoal burning going on. And these, again, were panoramic stitches. So, say, for example, because I wanted to kind of convey the modern world invading. And part of that, and the reason for shooting in color, was to use the color very expressively. So, the orange light of motorway freeway lights, or the red light of red vehicle tail lights. And these would what be lighting the animals, which is something I've never seen before. So you'd be seeing animals not lit by natural light, not lit by a flash on the camera, but just this light coming from all different directions. And so the shot was worked out. So yeah, I knew I was going to park a bus with blue light emanating from the interior of the bus, because those East African buses have all these crazy, weird light coming out of them. So you've got these flashlights with blue gel set up on scaffold towers. You wait forever in the hopes, weeks, if not months, for animals to come in. They trigger the motion sensor, that then the camera takes 3 photographs in quick succession, and the lights flash, and now you've got this blue lit elephant. And then weeks, if not months later, you then drive in a bus with blue light pouring out of it and merge the 2 frames shot from the same position. And then the bus is filled with people. That's one of the simpler ones, because you just drive a bus in and with blue lights inside. There's others that were much more complicated, like, a bridge construction overpass. And in those instances, I'm not building real, they're art directed, but they are there. And for me, it was had much more aesthetic and emotional integrity, that everything was shot for real in the same place. The cheaper, more sane version of this, but inferior version, would have been, I take a photograph of the animal, and then I go to Nairobi, on the outskirts of Nairobi, and I photograph something roughly matching, and I just put the 2 together. I, in my obsession, wanted to shoot everything in the same place, but it took months. And oftentimes it didn't work, because I was very naively thinking, oh yeah, this elephant will stop at this waterhole the size of 3 bathtubs, when there's like 2 trillion gallons of water at the swamp just 2 kilometers away. Like, what on earth were you thinking? So a lot of times we'd have to break down that setup and then move the waterhole and the cameras to a much more realistic place that the animals might stop to have a drink at a tiny waterhole. That were always out of frame, just below the frame.
Were you just sleeping in a vehicle, like roaming around, trying to manage these?
No. We were all in base camp, and we had this intranet set up, where each morning we would download at base camp all the photographs, or lack of photographs, overnight from the cameras. So it would be like Christmas morning, or not, every morning, when you'd kind of see, oh Jesus, another night of nothing coming in. Or once we got the locations right, hundreds of frames of elephants. And then you have to just look through and see the ones which have got the most potential, when you then re-photograph and compose, stage the people kind of around where the animal's going to be within that panoramic frame.
Did you have any mess ups where you got the animal and then something happened and the camera was off a notch or something and it couldn't line up, or were you able to get all that?
No, it always lined up. That was fine. That wasn't the problem. The problem was just getting the animals to begin with. And then it was brutal. 2 months of night shooting is not anything I would recommend to anybody. Where every night there are these horrendous dust storms that just leave your eyes red and burning. And then we had to finish before the rains came, because the 2 elements photographed weeks/months apart had to perfectly blend. And you can't do that if the ground's different, if it's muddy versus dusty, etc.
Yeah, so many factors.
But the point is, I mean, I'm getting into the whole kind of technical side, and this is not a photo podcast.
I'm curious.
It's probably really boring for people who are not interested in this. But the bigger picture is the point that I was trying to make with this work. I mean, and also, again, very important, because people were starting to play a much more prominent role in this series for the first time. And it's really important. All the people in these photographs are not the villains. They are also being swept along by the tide of progress. The real villains are off camera, the politicians and industrialists who are doing what they do for short-term economic gain over long-term, ultimately long-term, far greater economic gain, whilst also preserving the environment. Because if you take away those animals, places like Amboseli, where tourism is an economic gold mine, if those animals are gone, you're left with semi-desert with a bunch of cattle and livestock, and no tourists are going to come and see that. And then everybody there, and then there are no NGOs to look after it. So it's a lose-lose for everybody. And that's what I mean about short-term economic gain versus long-term environmental economic gain as a result of good environmental actions. Because you just can't expect these places to survive just because we think they're beautiful. It's not enough. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
You've got to be pragmatic, especially in places like East Africa, which are, so I think, like outside of conservancies, that area outside Amboseli, the Maasai are one of the few left who still tolerate wild animals in their presence. And that is a huge deal. Here in America, people can't even tolerate a few wolves around.
So true.
Coyotes get shot. We are a very, very wealthy society. So why on earth would you expect extremely poor rural people to tolerate an elephant wiping out their annual crops in one night? Why on earth would you expect herders to tolerate the killing of their livestock by lions without retaliation, without going out and spearing the lion, spearing the elephant that raided their crops? You have to give them something in return. You've got to either protect them with like the electric fence, or reimburse them like the compensation program that Big Life does.
Yeah, there needs to be some kind of economic opportunities for them to survive and thrive without, having to rely on destroying the wildlife around them. So it's easy for us to sit back and say how everyone should act overseas and somewhere else, but the reality is much more complicated, and oftentimes, it's a result of our actions, whether we know it or not, and how we've, like you were saying, our corporations and governments have interacted with these other places and stripped them of the resources in a lot of cases. So, yeah. While we're still on this one, I just quickly, one of the images that really drew me in was the river of people with the rhino. I mean, it's the people standing there staring down at their phones. Just feels so today. I mean, you see that everywhere you go. But then there's this rhino in the center that we're losing this species, and people don't.
I mean, I worried it's almost become a cliche.
Yeah.
That the world's its life looking down at their phones, not engaging in the real world. But that was, when I shot that one 2018, that this obliviousness worldwide to the destruction of the planet.
Yeah, it's a metaphor. What are your thoughts on humans' role in the world? I mean, I feel like sometimes there's this separation. People think, there's humans and then there's the rest of wildlife, but we're all a part of the same planet and interconnected. How do you view that in our relationship with the rest of the world?
Well, that's a perfect segue for me into The Day May Break. I don't know if that was deliberate on your part, because, of course, in this body of work, I was dealing for the first time with climate change. And for me, in these photographs, you've got humans and animals within the same frame. The humans have all been badly impacted by climate change, everything from droughts to cyclones that destroyed their homes, their livestock, their livelihoods. And then you've got the animals that have all been rescued, that are everything was shot in conservancies and sanctuaries. And these animals are rescues that have become habituated as a result, and therefore were able to be in close proximity to the people. So they were photographed together in the same frame. Everybody thinks it's Photoshop. It's not. But my point of that, in relation to your question, is that with climate change, everybody ultimately, unless you live in an ivory tower, is affected to some degree by climate change. And typically, those least responsible, the rural poor again, in countries that have had very little to do with carbon emissions, unlike rich Western countries, are the most impacted. And so the thinking behind these photographs, the two together, is that we all live together on this one planet with very finite resources and nowhere to run from the pending, I can't think of another word, but I'm sorry, apocalyptic devastation. So kind of human and animal kind of all in it together. And in the places that I'm photographing, like Kenya and Zimbabwe in chapter 1 and Bolivia in chapter 2, one representative of Africa, the other representative of South America. Now there's a chapter 3 that I'm about to go off and shoot. They are places where, as I say, where the people are least responsible.
Yeah, and I saw on your website you tell some of the stories of some of these people as well. I don't know how did you find these subjects? I don't know if it was through,
There was a lot of research. I had researchers going out for weeks and weeks leading up to the shoot, looking for people who were willing to be photographed, who had strong stories. They had to have a good story, even, and if and then we would bring them to, everything had to be shot in these sanctuaries and conservancies, obviously. So they were all brought in, and I would just have 10 people a day there to just experiment with who worked with what animal, and it was sort of indefinable. It was a process of discovery. It was very spontaneous. Just couldn't tell who was going. Like you'd have this sort of really cliched idea of, oh, I'll put the bear-like man with the bear. That's in Bolivia, and then no, it's bollocks. Don't be so cliched, And then you'd find something really surprising that was just you couldn't put your finger on it.
You just had to feel it from within, just experiment. Yeah. Was there anyone that stood out to you? Did you get time to connect with any of the subjects?
So in Kenya and Zimbabwe, we did video interviews afterwards to get their stories on tape. So just as a example of one particularly moving story, there's a photograph, which is a photograph of a woman in Zimbabwe, Kuda, and Sky is this rescued giraffe. She's sitting at this table with a light bulb, illuminated by a light bulb. And over her shoulder is this giraffe just out of nowhere, leaning down, looking over her shoulder. And it's just completely unexpected. I never expected the giraffe to do that, but it did. Kuda's story. So we interviewed her afterwards, and she lost her home in the cyclone. In the floods, the floods that came from the cyclone. But in the process also, she lost one of her children and she had a miscarriage. And as she was talking in Shona, her language, she had floods of tears coming down her face. And towards the end of the interview, she suddenly switched to English and said, "But don't worry about me. I'm okay now. My life is like a ripened banana." And what she, I think, meant by that, my life is like a ripened banana, is that she was ready to live again. And that sense of resilience, when for most of us who lead very comfortable, easy, cosseted lives, that she was coming through that after all this loss, I thought was remarkable. And I'm really pleased that, a percentage of sales from my share of the proceeds from the sale go as a form of kind of biannual royalty payment to the people in the photos.
Oh, that's amazing.
And she's been able to rebuild. The money that we sent her has helped her to rebuild. Because the money that it goes a lot further in places like that. So for something that is relatively inconsequential for us goes a long, long way there.
Yeah, for sure. And it's speaking to the resilience too, spending a lot of time with mostly the rangers, but, getting to know some of them pretty closely, some of them having to deal with loss on a daily basis, whether that's rhinos or people they know because of the violence towards frontline workers. It's an amazing spirit that so many of them have that, like you were saying, I feel like most of us have kind of lost that. I mean, it's we lose our internet and our whole world comes crashing down. So it's just
Yeah.
it puts life in perspective when you are able to experience that.
Or to actually go one absurd stage further, when you can't get into your Instagram account.
Yeah, there's no one's responding. You can't contact anyone. It's yeah, it's
I'm so grateful that I got to have a childhood devoid of the internet and social media.
yeah. I mean, does any of that come into play into the way you think about all of this stuff? I mean, just the way our technology is kind of taking us away from our connection.
I think yes. I think a couple of things. Number one, I naively thought that the internet would be amazing for the dissemination of information. What I didn't realize was how much more impactful it would be in terms of the dissemination of misinformation or disinformation. And so I think you can attribute part of the rise of authoritarianism to the ease with which that misinformation and disinformation can be distributed. In terms of how people's lives have changed, when I see, 10-year-old kids with their parents' apparent blessing glued to their wretched screens,
Mm-hmm.
and how different that is to, I'm sorry, I sound like an ornery middle-aged
No,
git.
I get on the same rants. Keep going.
Yeah. But as an unashamed middle-aged ornery git, when I think to, what I was doing as a kid, which was out in the countryside bird watching and just the usual cliched climbing trees, and now everything is lived through screens, how on earth, with that level of desensitization to nature, how do you engage new human beings on a visceral, emotional level where they need nature in their lives?
Yeah.
Not just sort of like look at it as something on a TV screen, but they need it. They understand how much of a difference it makes to their general mental well-being.
Yeah, you wonder, I feel like we're struggling with so much depression and mental anxiety. And, I'm sure a huge part of that is because we're staring at these screens. But I wonder how much of it is because those screens are keeping us away from being out in nature. Because it's, spending a lot of time out in the bush in Africa just really reconnected me. Because I feel like I've gotten away from it as well. Everything's on the computer or the phone. And it's amazing how just even a walk during the sunset through, nice little patch of nature can completely relax you and rejuvenate you and give you space to think. But it's so hard to even do that sometimes without, reaching for that phone. It's just such a habit.
No, I know. But you see, I think that every new human is born with an instinctual connection to nature. But if it's not nurtured, peer pressure, iPhones, iPads, blah, 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 quickly will kill that instinctual connection. And then maybe you hope that later in life, people will find their way back. But sometimes it doesn't come until, somebody's in their 40s and they've just got a little bit more space to sort of step back and go, oh, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be connected at birth, I would imagine, because we are from that world. But especially if you grow up in a city and have the screens everywhere, it's just, how would you even know what that experience is like to want to have it?
Yeah, but I grew up in the middle of London, but fortunately only a few hundred meters away was a park.
Yeah.
And that was where I spent my entire childhood, whether again it was bird watching, playing football, cycling around, kind of doing my own botany lessons in the bushes and trees. So there was, and then as fast as I could, I mean, thank God in that day and age, at the age of 10, no parent would allow this now. I was on a train with my bicycle, cycling around the countryside, bird watching. So, but no parents allow that sort of thing anymore. You'd probably get arrested for irresponsibility. I don't know. But that was an incredibly integral part of my childhood. It gave me my wanderlust and it gave me every fond memory from my childhood. in the countryside in the summertime. I don't have a single fond memory of my childhood from the city. None.
It's interesting.
Now that's me, but I think if a lot of people think about what are my fond recollections from childhood, I kind of think that a lot of them would be outdoors, running around, not inside looking at your screen.
Yeah.
I mean, where are those moments of joy?
Yeah. I mean, I was lucky. I grew up in a pretty rural area in Ohio and just spent almost all my days and some of my nights out in the woods and collecting bugs and crawling around on the ground. And yeah.
And see how it's made a difference?
Yeah.
So you're now doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're making this Rhino Man film. And so that did make a fundamental difference in your life. And would you be the same person if you grew up with exactly the same brain today? Who knows?
Yeah. It's so hard to say. I just want to say, kind of looking at this, The Day May Break series, I feel like the photos on one hand have this feeling of loss and sadness and this dream quality, but I don't even know how to explain it, but I feel like you can almost sense the love and compassion you have for your subjects, the way you take these photographs. And it's something
that, good. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I can't technically say how it is, but it's just a feeling that I get.
Well, that's a big deal for me. I mean, I was very apprehensive about whether I could photograph effective portraits of human beings. And I realized that I could when I felt a sense of injustice. I knew these people had been dealt, rotten circumstances in their lives. If you asked me to take a powerful portrait of somebody in Beverly Hills, I wouldn't know where to begin. I would take a crap portrait because I'm not. I look. Maybe underneath there are lives of sort of sad. I mean, everybody's got sort of something bad that's happened in their lives, but it's not the same as losing your home, your livelihoods, and sometimes your kids through something that was no fault of your own.
When you were working with the subjects in this case, were you connecting with that story as you were getting ready to work with them? Do you think that brought you a little bit closer?
It certainly makes a difference. Absolutely. But the other thing that's worth mentioning is that it can all sound quite bleak, but there is a sense of hope in these photographs, in that everybody is a survivor. They made it through. They're still here. They're still alive. And while you're still alive, there is hope and possibility. So, and that applies for both. I mean, the animals were rescued from terrible situations, and now they're looked after with love and care in great, environmental organizations, sanctuaries. Like all of them, all the places I've worked, all do wonderful jobs in terms of the care of the animals that are on their land.
Yeah, I know some of the northern white rhinos from Old Paget. I talked with James Mwenda a while back. And yeah, just incredible work there. And I mean, it's such another sad story, losing those rhinos. But there's still some hope in that story too, that something could happen to save them with all the crazy genetic stuff. But it's sad that we're in this position. I'm curious, where are you finding hope these days, whether it's in your work or some other aspect of your life? What brings you hope and maybe even joy in your day-to-day life?
In relation to the environment?
Just in life, like what kind of brings that spirit of joy and hope to you?
I'm looking at her right now, my dog. I can honestly spend more hours watching her snurfle through the grass than a wild elephant in East Africa. I am endlessly fascinated by the minutiae of animal behavior on its most mundane level. I'm just watching her all curled up on the sofa here, and I could just look at her forever.
Could you tell us what kind of dog she is, or just paint us a little picture?
She's a shelter mutt. I mean, kind of a sort of lurchery. I mean, a lot of people don't know what a lurcher is, Nick, but she's gorgeous.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a beautiful thing too, is just, this interspecies love. I mean, I grew up with dogs all my life. My one buddy I was just rooming with for the last couple of years, he has a red-haired Labrador retriever. And It's just an amazing, loving dog, and it's just I mean, I feel like dogs, especially. You come home after a long day and you see that tail wagging, and they just want to give you love.
Oh, I get that after if I'm gone for 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter.
It's like I've abandoned her, and it's like I've been gone 10 minutes. Doesn't matter. Like the same level of excitement after 10 minutes as if I'd been gone 10 hours, which I never am, by the way. She's never left alone for anything like that time. And she's got land to run around all day and night. If I just quietly, while you were talking, let her in, because there was much scraping at the window as you were talking.
Yeah. That's amazing. And, looking into the future, how far do you feel like you're going to take the Day May Break series? I know, in the description.
Until I run out of money. Yeah, I mean, because these projects are so expensive. Chapter 3 is in Fiji.
Oh, okay.
And
beautiful.
That's going to be incredibly expensive. It's very different. No fog, different element.
Interesting.
And it takes a lot of print sales to break even. So don't know how much longer I can keep doing it. Maybe at some point I'll be forced to either A, photograph flowers in my garden, or B, go over to the dark side, or the deplorable dark side that is, wondering if you're going to guess, NFTs.
Oh, geez.
Which I think are just, I mean, I could start a rant, but there's just, half the podcast would get used up on me ranting about the whole notion of NFTs. But we won't waste time of the podcast talking about that.
I did do a deep dive on that like a year or two ago, because I was interested in, what could you do, but I was kind of sad after all the work I did. It was mostly scams.
Yeah, if you ever see my work as NFTs, just know I've become desperate. So I'm sort of justifying. Yeah, I'm justifying it, and this is real. That if it's the only way to keep making my projects is to sell it as these ridiculous JPEGs that everybody else can look at and some idiot has bought as an investment, then you can come back and play part of the podcast and torment me with it.
Yeah. I think there are actually some legitimate uses that, I think if there's something more than just the image attached to it that you can gain access or do with it, it could become interesting, but there's just so much garbage right now. And I feel like people are just going in circles playing games to try and flip something to make some cash.
Yeah.
Not really.
But the point is, I mean, I take photographs to exist in print form.
Yeah, exactly.
There's every photographic print is different with every photographer, and I can't tell whether I've taken a good photograph until I print it. But whether it's printed on as a platinum print, a wet collodion print, whether it's printed on rice paper, watercolor paper, it's fundamental to the signature of that image. A stupid digital JPEG, everything looks the same. And so what's the point?
Yeah.
Anyway, look, see, I've started ranting.
No, it's okay.
Change the subject.
To keep you from falling into the depths of NFT life, where can people go to support your projects, to buy your prints, books, support Big Life? What are the best places people can track you down?
Well, obviously donations to Big Life on Big Life's website, biglife.org. In terms of my work, the galleries that represent me that are listed on my website. And as I say, a percentage of the print sales goes to the people in the photographs. But also a really good way to see the work is via books, infinitely superior to a computer screen, or God forbid, bloody Instagram, which is the world's worst visual platform. The idea of gauging anything visually complex, like Inherit the Dust of This Empty World, on a 2-inch screen. Oh, look, here I go on another rant.
Oh man, I feel you. I mean, Instagram, you just, even if it's beautiful and you're like, oh, this is and then you flick it to the next one and you're gone. You don't even have time to process.
No, there was last year, I think it was like a half day Instagram was down. I was so happy. It was a most wonderful half day of the year. And then unfortunately they got it up and running again. I was like, oh, shit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm someone that prefers books, and if I had my camera on, you'd see that I have like 30 boxes of books in this new place that I just moved into that I have to unpack. and I probably need to get rid of some of them, but that's my addiction. But yeah, it's just such a different feel, and again, just another reason to get away from the screen. I think any reason is good.
Yeah. No, anytime I like somebody's work, I just buy a book of it if it exists.
Absolutely.
But I mean, I will say, obviously, the democratization of photography through the internet and even through wretched Instagram is of worth, that you discover that somebody who's photographing in their village in Mali can get their work seen and get a following that gradually spreads. And if, that is wonderful.
Yeah.
As long as people don't only view it on their goddamn phones.
Yeah. If the phone is a gateway to something in the real world, then I'm all for it. But just don't get lost in there.
And if you actually read about it, I mean, this is one of the things about the photographs, that in an ideal world, a photograph stands completely on its own merit without any written context. But in the instances of The Day May Break, for example, where you can read about what the history of these people is and what the history of these animals is and where they are now, that makes the photograph so much more impactful and hopefully moving.
For sure.
So I've not yet figured out a way to take photographs without the improvement of that written context.
Yeah, I mean, I think the photo can stand on its own, but like you said, I think the written word does add another level to it and more layers and more depth to what's happening in this person's life, which I really enjoyed reading some of those stories. So yeah, it's been really amazing chatting with you, Nick, and you're doing incredible work.
Well, thank you.
Not only just incredible art, but the causes that you're supporting and the awareness that you're creating. I think it's extremely valuable for all of us and a great way to wake people up to where we can be headed if, at a very fast pace here, if we don't do something fast. So really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to have been part of this podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nick. Thank you for listening to the Rhino Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Rhino Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who've dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the Movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.